Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the Lanier Theological Library and a former dean up there in Wheaton at the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. Our purpose in these podcasts is really very simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it, but to live it. Joining me today on Exegetically Speaking is Andrew Burlingame, who's Assistant Professor of Hebrew at Wheaton College. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago, studying Northwest Semitic philology. Drew, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, today we're going to talk a little bit about an interesting passage, a really complex passage in the Old Testament, 1 Kings chapter 18. Set it up for us a little bit.
Yeah, this is a really familiar episode. I think probably many of your listeners will be familiar with the story that's related in this chapter. Elijah, the prophet of the Lord during the days of King Ahab, has pronounced that there's going to be a drought on the land because of the people's sin. And this has gone on for some time. But then in chapter 18, Elijah goes and appears before Ahab and sets up this well-known contest that's going to take place between him and the prophets of Baal at the top of Mount Carmel.
Really interesting scene up there, everything that goes on.
Yeah, he proposes that he and Baal's prophets each be given an altar and a bull for sacrifice, that the sacrifices be prepared, but neither side should set fire to the offerings. Instead, they're going to call to their respective gods to send the fire from heaven. So the prophets of Baal spend the entire day calling out to Baal without any response. Whereas when Elijah calls on God to send fire, fire falls immediately from the sky and consumes the sacrifice, even the stones of the altar. Yeah.
So fire from the heaven, that sounds like lightning in a way, right? I mean, it's part of a thunderstorm or something like that. But there's a lot of taunting that goes on. I mean, he's a master taunter of the other side, isn't he? But when we come to a little bit later, and the drought, but before the drought is over, but kind of in that seam in the story, Elijah says to Ahab, "Go up and eat, for there is a sound of rushing rain." In other words, the rain's coming back, right?
That's right. In fact, when God speaks to Elijah earlier in the narrative and tells him to go appear to Ahab, he tells him to do so precisely because God wants to send rain on the land again. So he says, go make yourself known to Ahab so that the drought can be ended. And this is all kind of a lead up to Elijah praying to have the rains come in.
Right. So the rain hadn't really started. He's had the fire from heaven that's come down, but the rain itself hasn't started.
That's right.
Okay. So what happens next in the story? And how does kind of the close study of these languages help us sort of frame what's going on there?
Yeah, in the aftermath of the actual contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, Elijah goes farther up the mountain to pray for the rains to come in and end the drought. But what he does when he gets to the top of Carmel is not entirely clear. So it's in verse 42. He goes up and it says that he does something traditionally translated as to bow down. The Hebrew is vayighar artha. He bows down to the earth in traditional understanding of the passage. But the verb that's used here is not the typical way that you would describe bowing down, and it's a verb that only appears here and in one other passage. So its sense has remained pretty unclear. The assumption that bowing down was involved is in many ways just a guess based on context.
Oh, okay. And bowing down to the earth, it's not like he's worshiping the earth or anything, because you would bow down to God, right? You'd bow down to...
Right. The idea, in traditional interpretation, he's bowing down groundward. That is, he's bent down onto the ground.
Oh, okay.
In some sort of posture of prayer or something like that.
Okay. Because he does pray, right? I mean, he does pray a little bit later in the passage, asking God to, or has he already prayed? I'm trying to remember now in terms of that. But he's got this thing with his servant. The servant comes in and out, going and looking for the cloud that's supposed to be coming over there, right? So
that's right.
It looks as if he is bowing down, though, maybe offering some sort of prayer to God at that point. But what are some of the newer studies saying about that act of bowing down to the earth?
Yeah, so in this particular part of the episode, we don't actually have him uttering any prayers to the Lord. And part of the reason it's assumed that he's bowing down is because it does say that he places his face between his knees. So he's clearly assumed a posture of bowing of some sort. But that first verb, the verb gahar, is the verb in question. What does it
Ah,
mean?
okay.
Recent developments in the study of the Ugaritic language, which is a language closely related to Hebrew, may have raised a new possibility. There's a term related to the problematic Hebrew verb that appears for the first time in an Ugaritic text discovered in 1992 and published in 2000. In this Ugaritic text, which is actually an incantation text, the
Hmm.
term clearly refers to speech or some other variety of vocal production. And this finding has led a number of scholars recently to suggest that the Hebrew verb may likewise refer to a vocal sound production rather than to a physical posture like bowing.
Hmm.
Even more recently, just this last year, a scholar named Mata Ritchie has identified a related verb in Mandaic, which is a later dialect of Aramaic, which refers specifically to the sound made by a thunderstorm. Drawing,
Ah, interesting.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So it's
So
like he's
drawing,
he's making a thunderous sound with his voice
that's the
then.
idea. Yeah.
Huh.
Drawing these different strands together, Ritchie and others have suggested that Elijah, having ascended to the mountaintop, is actually making a rumbling noise imitative of thunder in order to call in the rainstorm. Now, this sort of symbolic prophetic action is exactly what we'd expect from prophets in Israel and Judah. You can
Oh
read
yeah, yeah.
like this in Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, where prophets engage in exactly these kinds of symbolic displays in order to bring about a particular action.
So
But we
prophets
wouldn't
aren't
guess
just
that.
people who speak. Prophets sometimes are people who act.
That's
They
right. Yeah. And
dramatize their message, right? They dramatically portray their message.
yeah, and there are good parallels for this elsewhere in the ancient Near East as well. But we probably wouldn't have guessed that this was an example of that if it hadn't been for this recent finding.
Is it more likely that these kind of language comparisons, maybe with Ugaritic or something, is more likely with those verbs or ideas that are rare? Like you said, this verb only occurs a couple of times in all of the Old Testament.
Yeah, I think, when we are dealing with Hebrew words that occur only a couple of times, we have so few data to go with, on internal terms that
Right.
finding how cognate terms in other closely related languages are being used can help shift the picture quite a bit.
Do you think there's anything? And I know I'm going outside what we were talking about, but when he pours water all over the sacrifices and the altar, and he just drenches it, and it fills up the trench there. I mean, that seems to me to be sort of symbolic of what will happen in a big rainstorm.
Well, that's an interesting thought. I hadn't considered it. I've typically heard that described as sort of making it an even more impossible challenge on the one hand.
Right,
Uh,
which it would be. It's hard to start a fire when everything's all the wood's
no,
wet,
that's
right?
an interesting idea.
Yeah. So anyway, I just thought as you were speaking and as we were thinking about this, I'm wondering if there's any connection between the pouring of the water and then later the kind of maybe the thunderous sounds that he makes toward the earth at that point. That's a really interesting reading, and we're helped out by knowing these other languages, not Hebrew, not Greek, not Aramaic, but these other languages that were existing before and during some of that period, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Great insight today, Drew. Thanks for being with us on Exegetically Speaking.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks to Silvio Vasquez, Rebecca Larson, and Krista Sanchez for helping us to produce this podcast. Thanks as well to Phil Keggy for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, the best place you could do that is Wheaton College. They have an amazing program, one of the best I've ever seen, whether you want to be a graduate or an undergraduate student. So go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Contact us at exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.